Hi everyone, my name is Elena Martinez and I'm one of the artistic directors at the Bronx Music Heritage Center. Welcome to our October program from Music by the Book, where we interview authors and musicians about new books and publications that have come out that talk about the Bronx and music and all things related to that. And we're really excited for tonight's discussion. We have not only the author but also the subject of the book. So we'll get to that in one moment. Before we start, though, I just want to give a shout out to our funders. The Bronx Music Heritage Center programming is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the New York State Legislature, public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Lily Auchincloss Foundation, the Laurium Tisch Illumination Fund, and the Howard Gilman Foundation. So tonight, as I mentioned, we're really lucky. We have with us the author of a new book that has come out fairly recently, Cisco Bradley, who his new book, Universal Tonality: The Life and Music of William Parker. And we have with us also Mr. William Parker, the jazz bassist, who is also the subject of the book by Cisco. So we're going to be talking to both of them tonight about the new book and about Mr. Parker's life, from the Bronx to the Lower East Side and his career in avant-garde jazz. But then I also want to introduce to you also the co-artistic director, the other artistic director of the Bronx Music Heritage Center, who also is also a jazz musician. And since tonight we're going to be talking a lot about avant-garde jazz, I just want to mention a few names. Bobby, as many of you know, has his roots in jazz and Latin jazz, but he's performed with some folks who are in the sort of orbit of what we call free jazz, avant-garde jazz: Henry Threadgill, Warren Smith, Jorge Sylvester, and Boom. So with that, I want to introduce to you Mr. Bobby Sinabria.
Saludos amigos, buenas noches a todo el mundo que está escuchando y están sintonizando y mirando. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another edition of Music by the Book. Ladies and gentlemen, when depending on who you speak to, when you mention the term avant-garde, well, it could get very contentious at times. And we're going to explore that and the history of that music or that musical genre in terms of the jazz movement, particularly here in New York City, with one of its principal participants, contributors, etc., the virtuosic bassist, Mr. William Parker. It's a fascinating evening tonight of discussion because Mr. Parker at one time lived in the Melrose Projects, where I grew up in the South Bronx. So we're going to be talking about not only music, but of course, living in the South Bronx, the music scene at the time, etc., and what's happening right now. But to continue our discussion for Music by the Book on this fascinating new tome and its fascinating subject, the one and only Elena Martinez.
So I just want to start the discussion off tonight with the author of the book, Mr. Cisco Bradley. He's an associate professor of history at the Pratt Institute, and he's the author of a couple books, and the book we're going to be talking about tonight is Universal Tonality. And also, Cisco is also the founder of www.jazzrightnow.com, which is a review of the New York free jazz scene, improvised and experimental music scene. So I guess starting off with that, Cisco, can you just tell us what was your inspiration to write this book about Mr. Parker?
Well, it's great. I always say it's the greatest honor of my professional life to have been involved in writing this book. To me, it began many years before I met Mr. Parker. When I first listened to his music about 16, 17 years ago, and of course I was late to it. I mean, he'd been playing for over 30 years by that point. So, I began listening to him, listening to many of his records, and I'm originally from Wisconsin. When I discovered this music, I remember thinking it was just sort of my secret because I didn't know anyone else who listened to it. I mean, I didn't have any friends there who were into it at that time. Of course, now I do. But to me, it was just this sort of mystical music that I was hearing and enjoying and investigating and kind of exploring. And then a few years later, I happened to get a job teaching in New York City at the Pratt Institute. So suddenly I went from, this being this sort of, little, like I said, this little secret of mine to being something I could go and explore live. And I think because the music is so incredible live, to me, that changed how I thought about it, how I listened to it. And so I began going and hearing people play. And one of the first people that I listened to regularly in the live scene in New York was Mr. Parker. So I felt very lucky to be in a city where, this stuff was happening all the time. And I think it's something as I've now lived here for over 10 years. I think it's something we can kind of sometimes lose perspective on how incredible this city is, all this stuff that's happening. And when I look at it, almost every night, there's one or two or three or four things that I want to go and hear. Of course, I can't go every night, but this is what we're surrounded by. And I think we're so fortunate in the city to have that. I remember seeing Mr. Parker play a number of times in the years that I was here, and eventually I approached him in 2015 about doing the book. And we'd done one interview before that, just for the website for jazzrightnow.com, and I feel like we'd been able to explore it and really kind of work well with one another. So I approached him, and we kind of moved quickly from there. I think really the inspiration to me is to see, to try to explore the thinking of a true groundbreaker. To me, that's what Mr. Parker has been doing for the past 50 years. So, and to, I didn't want to, I wanted to think about the music. I wanted to think about his thought process. I wanted to kind of see what the history was that it was rooted in. And I think from very early on in our discussions, I was amazed at how profound his sort of perceptions of the world were, and how incredible, how deep of a thinker he was, and is and kind of how he came to the music. So to me, it felt like it went from what could have been just another jazz biography to really kind of investigating the history of a music in a way through his thinking. So I think that's what I found most inspiring, and approaching it that way. So and then of course the book built out from there. So.
And one thing I want to say about the book, which for me, because I'm not a musician, so and when it comes to this type of jazz, this is completely new to me, free jazz, avant-garde jazz, and I reading the book, and then I guess it's sort of interesting that this came out, and there's that new documentary out, Fire Music, about the free jazz scene, and so I went to see that because like, okay, I'm in this mindset right now, and I must say the documentary was good and gave the sort of a chronology of the key players in the movement. But I thought your book, to me, was so much more, so much deeper in the sense that you got into sort of like the political and sort of the political connection to the artist and the music and the scene, the community connections, which the documentary didn't touch upon at all. Which I do want to talk about at some point, which we'll get into that part. But I guess before we start and go any further. And I think we're going to talk about the Bronx, definitely, about all the Bronx connections. But I just want to talk about, maybe for everyone watching. Oh, and everyone watching, please put any questions you have for Mr. Parker, for Cisco, in the Facebook comment section, and we'll make sure that they get a chance to respond to you. So, what is free jazz, avant-garde jazz? I know in page 6 in the book, you talk about critics have defined it as an art form writ large. It emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s as a movement in music that would push back against the limits imposed by regular rhythms and tempos, chord changes, and tones of the bebop era. It aimed toward creating something new. And then you go on to talk a little bit more about the sort of like the revolutionary aspect of it, which I think we'll get into later. But do you think, and I guess either maybe both of you can take this question, and Bobby might want to add some things about his ideas about free jazz, avant-garde jazz. Is that a good sort of summation of what free jazz is?
Well, I always thought that free jazz, well, one of the ways of looking at it is that when you call it, I don't think the musicians really necessarily labeled it jazz or free jazz, but you were free to play from a huge vocabulary of sounds, rhythms, and melodies when you were playing music. But I always thought that when you listen to Coleman Hawkins was not constricted. Coleman Hawkins was playing beautiful. So when you're playing beautiful, you're playing free. Louis Armstrong was playing beautifully, so he was playing free. And that's with Ben Webster and Sonny Rollins. So I think any music that works on a high creative level is free, because it not only is the when you talk to the musician who just played it, you say, "Did you feel not free when you were playing?" He says, "No, I'm playing. I'm using vibrations that's coming through me. It's not about being free. It's about playing something that's beautiful, and then you can connect it with whichever system of music you want to connect it with. But the idea is that you're playing something that will uplift people and heal people and open a door for them to see something brighter and better than they're seeing in their daily life. So I don't think I think all the great masters, including Duke Ellington and Thelonious Monk, were really not into confining, but letting the musicians flow with the music, so the music takes a life of its own. And it's not so much, well, it got to be a thing. Okay, well, we're not playing chord changes, or we are playing chord changes. You're always playing changes. And when you go from one breath to another, you're playing a change. So, and if you want to play chord changes, play chord changes, as long as it's working on a high level. If you don't want to play chord changes, don't play chord changes. But the other thing is that if you have a wider view of music, and you look at the music of Northern Africa, you look at the music of China, Korea, all over the world, those are all systems of music you can kind of rely on. There's, and we learned a lot from Yusef Lateef, from Don Cherry, going into what they now call world music, but it's just music made by people of the world, and all of this is available to us, and some of us hear in different ways. I mean, Johnny Hodges played melodies all the time, sweet, beautiful melodies, and his way he played was the way he communicated. Charlie Parker played melodies, but he also played rhythms and harmonies.
Well, is there and when we talk about free jazz, I mean, I think it seems to be it's used, and this might be my mistake, that it's used you can kind of use either word, like free jazz, avant-garde, experimental. I mean, do you use these interchangeably, or is there something different about that? Or you could say what you're talking about is also what people would call avant-garde or experimental as
Well,
well.
it all depends on who you're talking to. It's like getting a bank loan. You might want to wear a suit when you go in the bank to get a loan, so you wear a suit. If you're going to a community center and they're playing some ball, you might want to put on a some sweats and some sneakers if you're going in that situation. So I really just call it music, and but when I'm teaching, the younger people, I just make aware to them that they've got choices, and that what's correct for one person might not be correct for another person, because it's all about their heartbeat and how they perceive music.
If I can add in a little bit, I mean, I think that, first of all, I think we define these terms, rather than having the terms define the music. I think so. I think that's one thing. The other thing is I've noticed that a lot of the terminology is almost generational, or people from different eras might use different terms to describe the same music. So some of it is that. I think. I mean, I guess it's good to have terms that we understand to some extent, so that we have some sort of common vocabulary, so we know what we're talking about. But at the same time, I think sometimes this sort of drive to categorize, sometimes I think limits our understanding, or somehow kind of separates. I mean, things. So I think it could sometimes be problematic if we're trying to kind of overly define something.
Now, Bobby, did you had mentioned there's you had some questions about classical musicians or composers that might have had an influence on this? Did you want to?
before we started, I just started thinking, going through a Rolodex of composers who would be considered avant-garde, modernist, futurist, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to ask Mr. Parker if they, some of these names that I'm going to mention, did they influence you or any of your colleagues when you were coming up in what our topic tonight, free jazz? I'm going to mention some composers right now for the for those of you who are watching right now that are musicians. I might describe a little bit about them. Uh, Harry Parch, who was very known as a uh, forward thinker, and he also built musical instruments. Arnold Schoenberg, Igor Stravinsky, Don Ellis, Joseph Schillinger. Do any of these names like mean anything to? Did they mean anything in terms of an influence to you or any of your colleagues?
Well, my colleagues, I know Warren Smith worked with Harry Parch and Anthony Braxton and a lot of the musicians from the AACM, uh, and as well as John Coltrane were aware of Arnold Schoenberg and um, some of the modern composers, Charles Ives. But myself, I was like a black nationalist, so
Mm,
I didn't really deal with classical music so much. I mean, just my main man was Duke Ellington, and
hmm
but I was not opposed to listening to stuff because it wasn't so much about being playing something out of the box. It was just like playing something that was, again, that was strong and beautiful. So if I hear some music and say, who was that? Well, that's Dave Brubeck. Okay, I like that. I dig it.
Right.
Or if you hear something, that's something even older, you say that's 1812 Overture, uh, Tchaikovsky, and or Maurice Ravel. I dig, you dig that too. So I wasn't so much into trying to look like how can you play something new when when you can't play nothing? You know what I mean? It's
Right,
like
right.
when you first start out, you got to find a hook somewhere to figure out. So you don't really think about playing something new. But then what happens is, as you go on, you say, well, I like to, I know I'm supposed to be able to play the blues, Mr. Parker, but I can't get into that blues, man. So you don't have to get into the blues. If an Indian musician came here and he said, well, for me to play certain raga, I said, I don't know what that is. So I said, well, why don't you play the blues? So I don't know what that is. So we all have our, the things we think we're supposed to learn, but then things that we can just like because we like them. So, but it's all unified. That's the whole thing about the universal sound, the tonality, that it's all connected, it's all hooked up, it's all sound. And I think that's what makes music a universal language. I mean, if you took a Russian, I said this before, a Russian baby, a Japanese baby, a Chinese baby, a baby from Alabama, a baby from Puerto Rico, and they say, okay, babies, cry. I couldn't tell you which baby from is the baby from Puerto Rico over the baby from Russia or the baby from China. It's all universal, and that's kind of the cry that we all have, and that's why we all can connect. Um, and it's okay, if a cat says, "Man, I can't play that bebop." Okay, don't kill yourself. You don't have to play bebop. Play what you can play, and that's your song. You know, it's just like your name. You say, well, I don't answer that name, but I answer to this name. My body moves this way, not this way. So once you find out how your body moves and how you hear, you just do it. And just there's no real like music police is going to say, well, you're not listening right. You can't do this. I mean, there are people who do that, but but it's more just playing what you hear and developing what you feel is valid to you and strong musically and artistically.
Well, riffing on that, you grew up in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, a place that is known. for universal tonality, many cultures coming together, many forms of music being expressed in the Bronx. When you were growing up, what were the first things that you remember listening to when you were growing up musically?
Well, I mentioned Ellington. Every night my father came home from work, he would put on Duke Ellington.
Mm,
Particularly, I guess I was 5, 6 years old. He put on 1957 Duke Ellington live at Newport at Diminuendo and Crescendo and Blue. And
right.
he put that on, and me and my brother would have a dance contest. We get a quarter. We both get a quarter, and like, and we just loved it. Somehow it went inside of us, and then I didn't hear so much music outside, because it was like we went outside to play basketball, play softball, the play, to do what we did. But I didn't hear any music except when the Jazzmobile came up there to the Claremont Center after we moved to Claremont. But it was mostly radio, WRVR, WKCR, WLIB was 24 hours jazz at that time. Billy
Right, right.
Taylor
I
Show.
remember. Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. I got home from school and could turn on WLIB, and they were playing Archie Shepp, and they were playing Miles Davis, and they were playing the music. So after a while, we just got, and then my father came home, and he came home with a saxophone for my brother and a trumpet for me. Then
Mm.
way later on, I found out it was my father's dream that we play in the Ellington Orchestra. I mean, he was into it. I mean, when Duke came out with that record, Duke at Ella's place, and Duke had a blue suit on, he would go and get us blue suits. He was really into it, but he never said anything.
Right.
I mean, because the fathers sometimes they don't, they just go to work and come home, put that on, and do what they do. So he never said like, "Well, I want you to play in the Duke Ellington Orchestra." But I figured it out later on when I was in my 40s, and he was long gone. That was his dream.
What did your father do, if I may ask?
He was a furniture repairman. He worked down at Morris Paul on East Broadway downtown in Chinatown there. And when they would bring in furniture for to be sold, some of it had scratches in it and cigarette marks, and he would repair it so that it's new. So
Wow.
he was a lot into that. And it wasn't until like maybe 10 years ago, Jesus, 10 years ago, maybe, yeah, about 15 years ago, that I was in Germany doing a tour, and my father came to me and in a dream, and he had these hieroglyphic scores that looked like pyramids. And he said, "Hey, I'm a composer too." He said that to me. And then I woke up in the middle of the night and wrote these scores out. And
Wow.
it's very interesting because, like I said, we didn't talk, but that was the thing. And they were into the house. I mean, my mother was a seams. She worked at the school as a school aide, PS2, and yeah, PS2, and then she was a cook. I mean, she would like cook every day. She'd bake a pie, a cake. She'd make fresh biscuits in the morning. It was one of those things, and I don't know how much fried chicken we ate, man. It's like, I mean, like 3 times a week. But and I didn't
Sounds
know
like your house was the place to be, man.
I didn't know what broccoli. I didn't know what broccoli was until I came down here. Everything was collard greens, green beans, and spinach. I mean, so we ate our vegetables. But that's how it was. And then she could sew anything. I mean, she would make my
Wow.
father's shirts. She would knit sweaters for us. They would reupholster furniture. I mean, it was like so all of that was running through the house, and and the music was on all the time. Saturday was music day. I mean, from 8 o'clock all day long, music would be on. My father's friend would come over, Mr. Rayford, and they would just listen to the music. But then
Wow.
I noticed as the day went on, they started to taste a little bit. And then there's one record to be playing, like the thing over and over, the same record, Willis Jackson, Gator Tail Jackson. And then he'd go to sleep, and we still listen to the music.
Wow.
But Hearn's department store. Remember Hearn's department store?
Of course, and Alexander's, and
Alexander's and Hearns. So we used to go to Hearns because Hearns was selling records for 99 cents.
yes,
They
yes,
were
yes.
switching from stereo records to monaural. So
Right.
every Saturday he would give us some money and say, get one for you and two for me. I know he only wanted Duke Ellington, so we got Duke Ellington or Ben Webster or for him, and then we buy one record. So that's how, in a way, we started to listen to other stuff because we just saw these Atlantic records, Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, and so we didn't know what it sounded like. We just liked the covers because these guys are like weird. What is this stuff? And then but then we ventured into listening to a lot of the Verve stuff. I got into Lalo Schifrin
Wow.
and Cal Jada, and see, because I was listening to a lot of movie soundtracks at the time. So Quincy Jones, Lalo Schifrin, Henry Mancini, as well as Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. So that's the kind of music I was beginning to like, as well as the Motown and all that stuff. But it was like a lot of music going around, but not so much in the neighborhood. The neighborhood was just, because I never went to parties, so I didn't go to the party music. I was always in my lab, in my room, doing stuff or, calculating stuff. So
Right. I meant to ask you, since your father was a woodworker and a furniture restorer, did he ever come to you later on when you were established as a professional bassist, go to you, hey, I can work on your bass and like do any repairs or anything like that? Did he ever do any work on your basses?
he died before, he died like early. He died like he was 63 when he died.
Mm.
And he had went to the Bronx hospital up there on the hill. And, we went there, me and my mother, and the first thing they said was, what kind of drugs is he on? What's wrong with him? And my mother said, no, that's what we're here for. And they had us sitting there like for hours. And then a doctor just walking by, he just had a stethoscope and he did like this. He said, breathe. He said, he's got a collapsed lung. We got to take him in.
Mm.
But that Morrisania Hospital and
Right.
the whole hospital was like, I don't know about them hospitals, Bobby.
No, I used to go to Morrisania too, and that big waiting room that they had. I remember seeing like some kind of war movie about prisoners of war, whatever, and I said, wow, this waiting room looks just like the movie that I just saw, But
So
I
coincidence.
know well. You'll be glad to know that hospital, that building, has been completely refurbished and is now beautiful apartments, affordable apartments for the community, and it was done by the parent organization that sponsors us, the Bronx Music Heritage Center, that's allowing us to do this now, and is known as WETCO, Women's Housing Economic Development Corporation. Nancy Bieberman, a very famous housing lawyer, bought the Morrisania Hospital for $1, refurbished it, made a public school in there, a grammar school with a music program, an arts program. So I remember when I first went in there, I was like laughing my butt off. I go, cause you go in the lobby. I go, wow, this is where the waiting room was, et cetera, So
So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Mr. Parker, was you had mentioned, it was mentioned in the book, in Cisco's book, that you went to the New York School of Music on 149th Street in the Bronx. Now, I've never seen that. Is that still there? What is there now?
I don't think, like down there, it was a store called Howard's Clothing Store at Ripley's. There was a Flourishine shoe shop there, and it was upstairs. And it was just like, I wasn't not saying mom and pop music school, but it was a just that school that gave lessons. I'm sure they're not there now. I haven't been in that area in so long that if they're still there, I'd eat my hat. It's one of those
no,
things.
they're not there anymore. But one person that told me that went there was Jerry Gonzalez. May he rest in peace.
Oh,
Did
I
you
know
cross
Jerry.
paths
Yeah.
with him at all at that
Yeah.
time?
Yeah, we were up at the Jazzmobile together, Andy and Jerry Gonzalez. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And
So,
Fantastic.
and also in the Bronx, I guess we had mentioned this earlier. So you spent like the first third of your life living in the Bronx, and you did live in the Melrose houses for a while, which Bobby also is from. And when it was funny reading about it, 'cause I think you tell stories about like the Black Muslims would come through the Melrose Project. I know Bobby has stories about them too. They would like come through and sell their paper and their pies and stuff, right? I guess to the Melrose houses. So you both had those stories about that, which was interesting. So one of the things I liked about what you said about the Bronx was that one of the things you say in the book, it's on page 55, for instance, you said, the whole atmosphere of the South Bronx is geared toward crushing a person's spirit, and most people don't have that kind of strength to resist. But yet you also talk about the magic of the Bronx. And on page 61, you have this. There's this really poetic thing you say about like the light between the buildings, the way it comes in, and how it reflects off bottles, and it's just so beautiful. So, can you talk a little bit about growing up in the Bronx? That there was this it's hard and it's tough, but there's also this magic and beauty. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
well, I mean, they used to have this thing, which it probably had all over New York. They had like a wine called Swiss Up and a wine called Thunderbird, and maybe there was another one. I wasn't a wine drinker, but I seen
Mad Dog. Mad Dog. Yeah.
a lot of cats, because they said it wasn't a grape to be found in Swiss Up. It was like a white wine. And so I seen a lot of people get into drugs, get into wine, get into drinking, get into stuff, and but mainly like the school, junior high school 55, where I went on Washington Avenue. I mean, it was like just so disruptive. I mean, you tell a story in there about Mr. Well, I guess he's not around now. I can mention his name, Mr. Pesaroff. He one day he took all the boys into the gym and he said, "Listen, I got to tell y'all something. None of y'all are gonna be anything. You're gonna be pushing them racks in the garment district, or you're gonna be messengers when you grow up." And so like we're like he's telling us this, before we even stepped out the door. He's telling us that we're not going, not we can be a doctor, lawyer, or anything we want to be, or even be ourselves. He's telling us this. So the atmosphere was very disruptive of creative thought in one way. But on the other hand, I did have some very good teachers that came through there that talked about philosophy, talked about history, talked about the military industrial complex, and lots of other things and they were a lot of them were substitute teachers. But I was lucky because I happened to be in the right place at the right time. Almost like if you're waiting for a bus and everybody gets on the bus, then there's a bus that says Williams bus. And so I get on that bus. And all my life I've been getting on the bus that said Williams bus. And it took me someplace I needed to go. And so I mean, it was just very lucky. But to answer your question, Bronx is, I mean, when we were kids, we used to collect bottles. And you had no money, you collect bottles, and you get 2 cents, or 2 cents for the bottles. And it was just a thing, like when they were making the Webster houses, and you go through there at night, and you collect bottles, and sometimes in the morning, the sunlight would just bounce off of these bottles or a field of broken glass, and you look up and you see the sky, and it's like it's talking to you. It's telling you something. Wow, I'm here for you. Don't. It's like the sky and the sun are telling you, I'm here for you. Don't worry. Now a lot of people, say, I don't. What are you looking at? I don't see that. But again, I was lucky that I was able to see these things, and we had grass, I mean, what was funny is that we went back up to the projects, and where we used to play ball, I thought it was that was like that gigantic. I said, no wonder we could hit so many home runs. It was nowhere, and it's like it's so small then, but you remember things differently. But and then going up, when I used to go up to Evander Childs in that area, visit my cousins, it even got wider because they had houses, so you could really see the skies. And the skies was always an informative thing for me. If you had nothing else going for yourself, you could look at the sky, and that could get you going for another day. It was great.
Fantastic.
Did you ever?
One thing I wanted to ask you. So you started off on the trumpet,
Yeah.
from what you said. When did you make the switch to the bass, and how did that happen?
Well, I went to trumpet, then I went to trombone, then I went to cello.
Mm.
Okay. And then sort of like my last years in high school, I I began to get interested in the bass. Actually, I was interested in the bass when I was playing the cello in the band. And but
And where was this? What high school was this?
it was Taft High School. No, it was junior
Oh,
high,
yeah.
and then Taft High School. I went to Taft High School.
Wow.
Uh, but it was really when I got really interested in it is when, as when I listened to John Coltrane of Love Supreme. I listened to
Mm.
Jimmy Garrison on there, and I listened to Percy Heath with the Modern Jazz Quartet, and a bassist named John Lamb with Duke, and any record, Richard Davis playing with Cal Jada and doing some of those loud, George Duvivier, and so I just felt that I could really want to play the bass and take a stab at jumping in that arena. But I knew that I had to learn how to play the bass, and but I was really getting obsessed with this free jazz.
Mm.
I mean, I really, this fire music. I was really like getting, like, that was like lighting me up, and so that was really getting underneath me. But I
So
was
was it Coltrane that opened that door for you
Yeah, it was
to?
Coltrane. It was Coltrane
Mhm.
because he said, that he played music to to awaken people spiritually. And then I said, that's the reason for music. We're going to play music that's going to awaken people spiritually. Not to, it doesn't mean they can't dance. It doesn't mean they can't do anything else to it. But the main thing is that that was the reason for me to jump into music. And then I was able to study with Jimmy Garrison and Richard Davis and Mill Tenton and Art Davis. And my last teacher was Wilbur Ware,
Mm.
and who was a very interesting gentleman. I mean, Wilbur was, uh, you never knew. He was dealing with a lot of mystery systems. Like he would never let you know what he was doing. I said, so Wilbur, when you played with Monk, what did he tell you to do? He said, do anything you want to do. He said, well, he didn't give you no chord change or anything. He said, no, play what you want to play. So, so I said, Wilbur, do you know anything about music? He says, what music? And that's how it was. That's how it was. And
Cryptic, yeah.
yeah, but then I'd come into his house and I knock on the door. I said, he said, who's there? Who's there? And I said, it's William. And he said, do I know you? I said, yeah, Wilbur. And I opened the door, and he looked at me and he says, it's six-pack time. So then I go get him a six-pack and come back, and then the bass will be over it. And he says, what's that over there? What's that over there? He said, you can't play that. You can't play that. Then he'd pick up the bass and he'd play something. Doom, 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 doom. And if I played doom, 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 he said, no, that's wrong. Then he'd pick it up again and he'd play doom, 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 whatever he played. If I played it, he said, that's wrong. Then I finally caught on to what he was doing. Then if he played boom, 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 if I played boom, 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 they said, that's it. So he was saying, you don't sound like me. You don't copy my licks. You don't sound, you find your own thing to play. And that's what he
Mm.
was telling me. He says, you don't, I can inspire you to play, but you're supposed to play your own thing. Because you your own family, you your own history, you your own everything. So find that. I mean, he didn't use those words, but that's what he was trying to, tell me. And
Right.
and Will would be playing down at Studio Ribby with Sonny Murray, and he'd be playing the avant-garde. Sonny Murray be going ah, and
Right.
so and Will was on the gig now. So Will was saying, "I think I'll take one now." and he step out and play softly as a morning sunrise. Boom, 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 boom. For 15 minutes, and everybody just looking at Wilbur. And he says, "I'm done now." And then they go on. Now Wilbur was a very interesting guy, you know.
For those of you watching, Sonny Mary was a drummer that, as William, Mr. Parker said, would be like moaning and yelling and just playing no time, just making effects and et cetera, et cetera. You can see him on YouTube if you want to check him out, you know. So, but I
But
wish, I mean, it sounds hilarious. It almost sounds like what you described as vaudevillian theater in a way, you know. I mean, the way Wilbur would speak, the way he was constantly like almost trying to get a rise out of you, but at the same time he's teaching, you know.
so, Bobby, I just want to go back to the Bronx for a second because later on, you guys talk about in the book Maxine Sullivan's The House That Jazz Built. I'm really interested in places. As I said, I'm not a musician, so I'm sort of interested in sort of like the infrastructure of the music scene and the where people played. And where we are in the Bronx Music Heritage Center, we're not too far. We're off Freeman Street, and Maxine Sullivan's house, where she actually lived, is not too far from there. And I know the House That Jazz Built is another place that her and her husband owned when they lived in the Bronx, which was almost like a boarding house, and they'd have performances there. And so can you talk a little bit about that? Because I've heard a lot about it. I know she had this place. I've seen some like flyers and archives, but can you talk a little bit about like Maxine Sullivan and the House That Jazz Built? What was that like and what went on there?
Well, at that time I was traveling all around with my bass, and I met this guy, Louis McMillan, who was a drummer. He played with Lionel Hampton, and he was Lionel Hampton's, at this time, he was Lionel Hampton's road manager. And so we used to do gigs with Walter Bishop Sr., Walter Bishop Jr.'s father. And Walter Bishop Sr. always would wear a suit, and he had a book of his own tunes. They were all in the key of C. And so we'd go like to the Hamptons and wherever, and we'd play these tunes. So there was Walter Bishop Sr., and then somehow there was a piano player named Dill Jones, who I think he's Irish, and he was playing with Maxine. So Maxine said, they said, well, Maxine, we're going to go up to the House at Jazzville. I don't remember the exact street, but I know that there were a lot of abandoned buildings on that street. Bunchy, Hetty Fox?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes.
She unfortunately just passed away last
Yeah.
year.
Uh,
Yeah, just last year.
I didn't know that, but she was up there for a long time doing stuff with the kids. And so Maxine would sing, and she'd play the pocket trumpet, and she'd improvise on the pocket trumpet, and be doing, you take the high road, I'll take the low road. She'd be doing some blues stuff, and I think Elmo Hope Jr. was up there. Bertha Hope was up there at this place, and as I recall, it was just it was a small place with a piano, and it was called A House That Jazz Built, and it was interesting because it was that time they started burning down the Bronx, and because in the Claremont projects, my mother could walk to the drugstore to get her prescription filled, but then with so many fires and stuff, she had to go take a bus to go to the pharmacy, after a while, and so things were just going up in flames. I didn't get up there as much as I wanted to, but I would go play with Maxine Sullivan, in the afternoon, and then I'd come down to Studio Ribby, Sam Rivers' place, and play with Sonny Murray. So I was going from one thing to the other. On Sundays, I was playing fashion shows up in the projects in Midtown, and we'd play with these ladies. We call them the post office divas, because during the week they work at the post office, but then on Saturday and Sunday, man, they put them dresses on, and then you can't tell them that she's not Ella Fitzgerald. Don't even try. And so we had a piano player, and they start in the key of G. So like they start in the key of G, and by the fifth bar, they in the key of X. And they be looking at you, what's wrong with the band? What's wrong with the band? So what's wrong with the band?
So they were free jazz artists in a way.
Right. And you couldn't say nothing because who wanted to say anything? We don't want to tangle with these ladies. But then on Monday, they go back to the post office or to the welfare office, wherever they worked, and they did their job. So there was a lot of those gigs. There were a lot of gigs with folk singers. They had a poetry theater on Prospect Avenue. Luis Reyes Rivera had one up there, and I used to work up there with the poets, and who passed through. I don't know if Miguel Algarin passed through there or not. He must have.
From the New York Region
Was
Post.
Papoletto? Because Papoletto, I
Yeah,
think,
yeah,
lived in the
yeah,
Bronx for a while. Yeah.
He was up there, and then later on, when I came down to the Lower East Side, I worked with Miguel Algarin, Miguel Pinheiro, Mikey. We used to work
Right.
together all the time, and then I worked with Allen Ginsberg
Wow.
and Don Cherry, so Amiri Baraka later on. So it was like wherever they needed me, I would, do stuff. But I still was going to play I'm saying the avant-garde, but I was going to play, because in 1974, I 73, I hooked up with Cecil Taylor,
Mm.
and we played at Carnegie Hall in 74. And then in 1975, I played a week at the Five Spot with Don Cherry and began to, record and get into the scene. And so eventually I funneled down to what the music I wanted to play. But underneath, as I tell the students now, you see, the root of the music for me was the funk and the blues. And if you listen to carefully in the matter of all what's going on in the music, the different time things and this and that, you'll hear the funk and you'll hear the blues and what I'm doing. And if it's not there, it's somewhere.
Right.
Because you got to relate to the people, to the heartbeat, and to the dance in the music. It's just not like no melody, it's got to be there somewhere that people can relate to it.
I'm curious. You just mentioned funk and the blues, etc. So, did you do any like funk R&B type of gigs when you were coming up at
Not really, just jazz gigs.
And did you ever play electric bass?
No, I had an electric bass. We used to play at the Third World Cultural Center, 167th Street.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. That's another Bronx place I hadn't heard of. Could you talk a little bit about that?
It was run by Ben Caldwell, who was a playwright and a poet. And Miri Baraka was up there. I had a big band up there. Sun Ra came up there once a week to play. And it was upstairs, called Third World Cultural Center. And but I never played. Every time I got an electric bass, I never played it. I got one now. Somebody gave me a fretless electric bass. It's been sitting back there for weeks now. I haven't touched it, but I'm going to get to it. I'm going to get to it.
So, can you the third world? Because I was interested again. The Bronx is one of these places that has sort of like unknown jazz history. You mentioned Elmo and Bertha Hope lived on Lyman. Even Thelonious Monk lived there for a short time. They were like neighbors to Elmo and Bertha on Lyman, like right where like Hetty Fox lived.
Bobby Battle lived up here, the drummer.
Yeah, Jimmy Owens, of course, and Valerie Capers are from that neighborhood too. And then there was all these clubs along like Boston Road, the 845 Club on Prospect.
They said don't go to that club. They said don't go. Mother wouldn't let you out the house to go to 845 Club.
Oh, why?
I don't know.
That was a hot corner, Prospect, Westchester, and Longwood. Yeah.
But so the third world though, was that sort of like that came a little bit later, I guess, right? So this is like the 70s, right? Like early 70s?
Yeah. And
when Herbie Hancock came from Chicago and stayed with Donald Byrd, did you first work with him at all or meet him at all?
Herbie Hancock?
Yeah. when he came to the Bronx and lived with Donald Byrd, and then
Oh,
eventually
I
lived.
didn't. Yeah, no, I never met him up there. I never met him
Mm-hmm.
up.
Mm-hmm.
You
Wow.
know, a lot of people lived in the Bronx. You know, we had two clubs where I was, the Salt and Pepper
Right.
and
Mm-hmm.
Sugar and Spice. They're owned by the same guy. And the Salt and Pepper was like on a hill,
Yep.
167th Street. I think Jerome Avenue was in the bottom, and the concourse was up somewhere on that hill. They had Monday night jam sessions, and they would book bands. And then the Sugar and Spice was around near Yankee Stadium, up somewhere around there. But I never met Herbie uh, in the Bronx. No.
Mm.
So now just look to we'll move downtown, I guess. We'll leave the Bronx and like move downtown. And one of the things I had mentioned earlier, I would love to hear more. And Cisco, because you, I think you write about this a lot in your book, and I was really glad because, as I said, the documentary Fire Music didn't really go into this at all. I think, and your book really, I think, delves into sort of the connection between like the Black Arts movement and of course the Black Power, and then the Black Arts movement was sort of like the artistic arm, the aesthetic arm of the Black Power movement, and then but then free jazz, avant-garde jazz, becomes really connected to the Black Arts movement. And can you talk a little bit about that? What's this political connection, and that also, Mr. Parker talked about the spiritual connection also in the music already. So, talk a little bit about how this was all, connected through the music.
I'm sure Mr. Parker can speak to this as well. But I think free jazz was, I think, a music of great expression at that time. I mean, it was many things, but it was certainly that. And I think, playing a role in kind of, this desire to kind of, push back against the strictures of society. And I think if you think of some of the aesthetic choices that people are making in the music, I think it runs, I think, fairly parallel to a lot of what people were trying to do in the streets. So to me, I think that the connection seems pretty clear. And of course, I mean, the music didn't happen in a vacuum. So I mean, the music was happening, and I think it was, it began, in the late 50s, early 60s, but it was, I think, gaining momentum through that decade, right? So there were many more people playing it in many more cities, even beyond, across the US in a lot of places by the late 60s. And I think it was, very closely connected to a lot of the cultural consciousness, Black cultural consciousness of the time. So, I mean, that seems pretty clear. I've done some research on free jazz in other cities, and it's a pretty clear pattern that you see over and over again in a lot of places. So I guess I would say that. Yeah, I think that, I think a lot of to me, one of the most interesting things I think about that era is that is this sort of fusion of all sorts of different genres, so, sort of genres and art forms and media and so forth, in the form of various types of arts, festivals and events and venues that were really catering to that, which I think is one of the things that made it incredibly rich, an incredibly rich cultural time, that all that stuff was happening in the same place. It wasn't, it's not like jazz was just happening in the club and then the poetry was happening at a poetry reading and et cetera, et cetera. I feel like, paintings at a gallery, a lot of this stuff was happening all together in the same space. And artists were really talking to each other. So, I mean, if you think of some of the great writers at the time, somebody like Amiri Baraka, who wrote about free jazz, but he's also a poet, he's also a writer, he's an essayist, he's a historian, he has all these things. I think so how much kind of there was crossover. Or if you take, and we mentioned this, and this is mentioned in the book, something like The Cricket, which is a sort of critical publication that came out in the late 60s. You had poets and writers who are writing about the music, writing about kind of culture across the spectrum. I think it just reflects kind of how much it was interconnected. And maybe it's our perspective now, looking back, somehow feeling as if, is it unusual for art to be very politically conscious? But I think at the time, when I talked to people, it seemed very natural at the time. I think a lot of society has been depoliticized over time. So this idea of sort of like, the separation of art from people, from the streets, from the political situation, I think in some ways, the the state that we live in now is much more unnatural, right? So the sort of, where they're often more separate. Though I think in recent years we've seen some return to that.
I think I like the fact that you said Jonas Mekas. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right. Mr. Mekas, you said Mr. Parker said you was really influenced by the quote. He said, "Who cares about good art, bad art when the world is dying?" And so this was like taught you that you just don't do art for art's sake. It has to have it should always be connected to something, connected to politics, connected to the community, and maybe Cisco and maybe Mr. Parker, either you could take this to talk about the connection to community. And I find it interesting because I know, Cisco, in the book, you wrote that Dan Morgenstern once wrote about Albert Ayler's music. The group sounded at times like a Salvation Army band on LSD. So it's not like, maybe that could actually be kind of interesting, I guess. But I guess he was critiquing it. He wasn't saying he was using that as a negative for the music. This art, what you talk about in the book, how this, is connected to the community, connected to the people who live in the Lower East Side and the Bronx. But if it was sort of like really avant-garde, how was it connected to people in a sense? Because it's hard to understand if you're not a musician, maybe, right? Did it have a sort of an elite element to it, or where's the connection that people from the community can draw on to this type of music?
I don't think there's any elite element at all. I mean, that's my perception. I don't think it's necessarily something that's hard to understand. I think it's something that sometimes I think it's something that can be felt. If you can feel it, then you can understand it. So, to me, in talking to a lot of people, it seems that it was this, if people describe it as music of liberation or music of self-determination, or there's a lot of the terms that I've heard people use to describe it. I think it certainly captured a certain time, and I think the ways that a lot of people were thinking at that time. I guess I don't. I guess I've always pushed back against the idea that something that is going beyond, that something that is particularly imaginative. Because I do think that's, to me, is how I hear the music. It's something it takes you to another place, or it makes you think beyond the horizon, or it makes you think more than what you've been, whatever the conventional things that you've grown up around. It might be surprising. It might even be unsettling if someone's not used to doing that. But I think if it takes you on a journey, I don't think it's necessarily hard to comprehend. It just might be might make you engage with something that's kind of unexpected, or something that you didn't know existed. I mean, I can only, in this case, I can only speak from my own experience, and it's a very different thing. I mean, I'm coming to this a generation later in a different context. But when I first heard a lot of this music, to me, it was just like, it took me to a completely different zone psychologically. I mean, to me, it was about, I remember, there are specific records I remember listening to the first time I heard Albert Ayler play Spiritual Unity. I remember putting the record on, and I fell on the floor and I couldn't move because it was so powerful. Because it was literally like as if someone said, like, my whole life I thought I was thinking within a certain number of parameters, and then someone came along and said those parameters don't even need to be there, and boom, there's this thing that's taken me somewhere else. So that, to me, is how that's how it spoke to me. I'm sure it spoke to other people differently at different times. So I guess that's what I would say. I think there's a lot of expression in the music, and I think sometimes we've become alienated from ourselves and sort of this comfort with thinking freely, thinking beyond the box, and thinking, what are the possibilities? I mean, maybe not every experiment works, or something, or whatever it is, or it may not always work, but there is sort of vast uncharted territory, I think, that in some ways, I mean, I think it's amazing what this music has done, but there's a vast territory out there to still be to be explored now. But I think that's, I guess, that's sort of my perspective. I think in terms of the vastness of the human imagination, the possibilities of experiencing this kind of thing.
Well, you know, the drummer Beaver Harris, who's played with Archie Shepp, he had this group called the 360 Degrees Music Experience. And what he would say, from ragtime to no time. And the way I looked at it is like, okay, we're a family. And so you have people who, you know, one skin color, one kind of hair, you know, tall, short, you know, chubby, undernourished, too much nourishment. And but we were all family. And it's the same with music, you know. So you have gospel music, you've got R&B, you've got blues music, you've got jazz and all its kind of categories. But what happened was uh, the music began to be pulled from the people. As you know, like WLIB, which I said played music 24 hours, they would play Archie Shepp and then play the Modern Jazz Quartet. It wasn't no big deal. You go to Paris, they're playing Billie Holiday, and then they're playing Sun Ra. You know, we're like, well, it's like, well, they're part of the family. But then what happened is, I think, when you had your post Beatles period and your pre Beatles period. So Beatles came around 1965, and rock music and pop music began to gather up steam. And so they began to say, okay, we can make money through pop music, and so we're going to diminish what they call jazz and Latin and whatever other kind of music that's not pop, and we're going to push this pop music. So you had people were selling Beatle guitars, Beatle suits, Beatle wigs. They even had a Saturday morning cartoon called The Beatles Save the World. And they never had, and Thelonious Monk was a hat wearer. They never had Thelonious Monk hats. You know, and all the jazz musicians were very hip. I never saw a Thelonious Monk or Charlie Parker cartoon. So, I mean, they just began to take over. And so pop music went up, and then people, after a while, the stations, RVR became country and western, and it used to be jazz, and WLIB became pop. And so the outlets for the music became narrow, and you begin to only hear one type of music, you know. So I think the next generation, they didn't know about the music, and fewer people know about it because in the communities, because it's slowly being pulled from them. And in order to find it, you got to be lucky, or you have to be if you have parents that come down, and it comes through your parents. But basically, just living a normal life, you might not ever hear Fables of Fathers by Charles Mingus, which is very political, or Freedom Now Suite by Max Roach, you know, and or Archie Shepp's fire music, you know, Malcolm Semper Malcolm about Malcolm X. So that slowly began to happen. And after the 10 years and 10 years, then another 10 years, it's like far removed from them. So, and the kids say, oh, you play jazz? Oh, that's that old fogey music. You know, my great grandfather used to play that. Yeah, man. You know, and here's the killer dilla, as they used to say. Uh, I was playing a gig with the Roots, which is a hip hop band, and so we were at the Knitting Factory. So I was a guest artist. Craig Harris was a guest artist, and Roy Campbell, a trumpet player. So we're in the back talking with all these hip hop guys, and so I said to them, y'all ever use real instruments like a real bass or a trumpet? And the guy said to me, come here, sir. Look out there. You see that big BMW? That's mine. And then he said to me, where's yours? And that was the attitude. That's my BMW. My music got me that. Your music is going to get me into, I'll be on welfare playing your music. So that's how it was kind of the attitude with some people. And it just began to go down.
We like to remind everyone. Well, I mean that it's a sad truth you just just said. I mean, anyway, all of us in the world of jazz have stories similar to that in encounters with pop stars, hip hop stars, etc. It's kind of a sad thing. One comment I would like to make: Elena was me and Elena were at the Grammys one year, we saw a hip hop guy get up there and he said, I want to thank my mother who bought me my first computer when I was uh, 10 years old. And
Right.
Elena goes, what? I thought he was going to say my first musical instrument. So that's where we're at right
Yeah.
now. But we like to remind you that if you have any questions for Maestro Parker, please put them in the chat. Please put them in the chat, and we'll be glad to answer them. We'll give them to you, pass them on to him in real time, and he will gladly answer them. Cisco, what I wanted to ask you is this book. Uh, how many was it a lengthy process doing this book? Like years, or was it a relatively short amount of time to put this book together?
It took, I think, basically about 3 years to put it together, and then another year kind of working with the publisher. But I mean, I don't know if that's a short time or a long time to write a book. It seemed relatively fast, and I think I do remember sitting down with William the first time in January of 2016, and I remember he basically said, let's just meet weekly and we'll just kind of work until we're done. And I think we kind of had a pretty workman-like work ethic to do it, I think. And so we met weekly for I think about 2 months, and then after that it was a couple of
Every
months.
time I put on the music for you,
So yeah, so I mean, I think we tried to work steadily, and after a while, anytime I needed to more information or whatever, I would get back in touch. And I worked pretty steadily through those 3 years, and then by 2019 it was pretty much finished.
So I have a question to get back to. We were talking about, the sort of connection to raising political consciousness, raising spiritual consciousness in the music. But Mr. Parker, you're, living on the Lower East Side, being on the Lower East Side, really connected there. That really interests me too, because I worked on the Lower East Side for many, many years as well. So I have this sort of Bronx Lower East Side connection, and that area down, Lower Manhattan is just really. I mean, from the 70s on, was just really incredible. Just the artistic, musical, cultural landscape there. I mean, even though there was great issues people had to live through, like bad housing, and a lot of there was things that people had to live through, and it was very political. There was a lot of activism going on there because of all this. It was just really rich in what was going on culturally down there. And so this is you have the chapter there in the loft scene, and this is this is where, like, okay, this is where, like, you really get into community. The artists are really connected to their community, because you have instead of clubs, right? Clubs and institutions where people play. In the loft scene becomes the infrastructure or the landscape to where the music is performed. So can you, maybe both of you can talk about different elements of that, talk a little bit about, the scene, what it was like to be a musician, to be connected to the community on that level, playing, basically in homes, in lofts that became these public spaces. And it's also interesting too, like the University of the Streets, actually another connection, the University of the Streets is now in the Bronx. They moved up to the Bronx, and I know they were there for a while on the Lower East Side. So, maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Well, start with the University of Streets, which was 7th Street and Avenue A, run by Mohammed. And that was a place where every Friday and Saturday they had jam sessions, and musicians who didn't have a place to stay could come and stay there. And they had some lessons. Jimmy Bass was over there. Barry Harris used to come. Barry Harris gave them the piano at the University of the Streets. And before that, previously, I think Kenny Durham was over there, and Bill Dixon was teaching over there. And so it was, I think he paid $1 for that building, Muhammad. And it was during the time that you could get buildings for $1. Everyone's rent was like $70, $80 a month. And up until the time of, and places were popping all over, because you could have a loft for $200, and then musicians could play there. You had hip neighbors. You had maybe a painter was your upstairs neighbor, or a writer was your downstairs neighbor, and everybody loved the music. and they were popping up all over the place. And around 1980, when Ronald Reagan came in, everything began to change. I mean, I had a CETA artist job. CETA is the Certified Education Training Act. I used to work with an organization called Theater for the Forgotten, and we would go around to prisons and do concerts. And we would clock in at 9 o'clock and clock out at 5 o'clock. The 9 to 5 job playing music, and that was all over the city. So, and then in the 80s, Reagan came in, the rents went up, and really total gentrification slowly began to push its way to the Lower East Side, and then all the way out to people from the Lower East Side moved to Brooklyn. Then the rents went up in Brooklyn. They moved to New Jersey City. You know, they moved out to Queens. They moved to Staten Island. They moved to the Bronx, and that gentrification, which is like a virus, followed them everywhere you went. You know. So it's rough. I mean, all the kids that go to the music schools now, they get to New York and they all like are sharing one apartment. You know, everyone pays $500 and they share an apartment. Whoever's parents have the money, they put their name on the lease, and that's how they live. But to get your own apartment now is like very, very hard. And that's why buildings like Clemente are so important.
Yeah, centers. And you mentioned CETA. I mean, CETA was sort of this like WPA of like the 70s and 80s, like a WPA program. It was really incredible. There were so many incredible jazz artists, visual artists, poets, who were part of that. Why do you think that sort of, I guess the funding shifted away from things like that too. I mean, that sort of changed the landscape too. I think you talk a little bit about that in the book, Cisco, right? I mean, just funding in the Reagan era just sort of shifted. Um, Jazz funding went down, right? Classical music funding was always high, but jazz funding went down. So it's sort of the whole the buildings were bought up by real estate. The funding shifted away. I mean, it's sort of like all these things sort of came to led to the decline of this really communal loft scene and that musical scene.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, to think in the early 70s, the National Endowment of the Arts earmarked $50,000 to support jazz artists, I believe. I think it was something like that. But they budgeted $3.5 million for classical music. So, I mean, the scale of it was always a bit off. Now, over time in the 70s, that funding for jazz artists did increase. But most of that came at the end of under the Reagan administration. I mean, there was these drastic cuts to kind of cultural, arts funding, and the country's never really gone back. It was never really restored what we used to do. So, I mean, the first big cuts I think came in 1982. I know some other drastic cuts came in 1995, and I think it's an unfortunate thing about the way that things have played out. I mean, it's really as a divestment in our own culture, and I'll never quite understand why the United States doesn't value its own culture a lot more. I mean, we have incredible artists.
They built a lot of prisons. They built a lot of prisons. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think if we were funding community centers, I think if we kind of like decided to, instead of trying to throw money at what we see as problems versus actually being proactive and making sure these sorts of things didn't happen in the first place, if we funded community centers, if we funded arts centers, all these sorts of things, I think we'd be just a different kind of country, and we'd be relating to one another really differently. And I think another thing I think that's interesting that I've thought a lot about is that the last time that I think this city, I mean, it's a complicated thing, but like to think that in some ways it was more possible to be an artist in New York in the 70s than it is, has been ever since. But we should think about that. I mean, the 70s is when, in theory, New York hit rock bottom, right? I mean, it almost, the city tried to declare bankruptcy. There were 1976, right? And in a lot of ways, people say that was New York's darkest hour or something. But ever since then, we've in the so-called sort of rise, the rejuvenation of New York, and there have been, it's not like there's not been any positive changes. There've been some positive changes, but the way this kind of the way that's played out has not been equitable even remotely, right? So and I was thinking about it. I mean, a lot of your sort of nightly types of gigs in the 80s might pay what they pay today, but rents have gone up by 2,000% or whatever it is, right? So things have really changed, and the money, the money's, I feel like artists are still being squeezed, in the way that things have played out. So, what does that say about, I don't know, but infrastructurally, we need to think about what we're doing.
No, what you're saying in that one thing that was in that Fire music documentary, I remember they had a whole section on the Europeans, like the Europeans were involved, and I forget her name, but this one European singer said, she goes, I feel so bad for the American jazz musicians, because in all the European jazz musicians can pay their rent, make a living, but in the United States, jazz musicians struggle. Why is like the music that's from this country, born here, our own cultural heritage, just musicians can't make a living. They just found that like so mind blowing that happens. That and it's still happening today. So
Well,
I mean,
it's not even just jazz musicians. I mean, it's a wide swath of creative people in this country. I mean, are poets making lots of money today? No. I mean, and unless our writers make, I mean, unless you're making it, you had it really big. And I always think, I mean, there's a musician that I interviewed a number of years ago who said, you have at the top, you have things like the MacArthur and and the sort of like these really prestigious awards that people get, and in between that and like $50 door gigs, there's actually not that much. So or whatever, you're getting, it's hard for a musician to make $50,000 a year or 75,000, whatever these sorts of like more kind of middle incomes, as we call them. I mean, it's like musicians, these are forced to kind of scrounge, or they're like suddenly, if they do well, they get vaulted up. But what's the middle ground? There's a lot of rock bands that can't make money either. But we could choose to invest in arts program, and invest in. I think there's a lot of ways that we could think to do that. I studied for a time in Ireland, and I was amazed at how many poets I met. And I was just thinking of like just some simple laws. They're up to a certain amount of income, they don't pay income tax. I mean, we could think of some ways to support artists, and that's just one of many ideas. But to think of how, I mean, I think if we did that, there would be a cultural renaissance in this country. There are artists just waiting for opportunities, waiting for support. It's never for a lack of ideas, right? So, I mean, I think it's amazing how creative the people are in this country, and continuously not getting support. And I think of, there's the Sound Unity Festival documentary called Rising Tones Cross. It was made in 1984. It was released in 85. And there's a German bassist in there, Peter Kowald, who is quoted very similar to, I think, the quote that you mentioned earlier, where he said, the poorest musicians in Europe, are doing better than most musicians in the United States. Why do we settle for that? Why do we settle for that? This could be a place of even, so much more music and art. We don't support it.
And like you said, it hasn't changed. I think a few years ago, the NEA was like, everyone was worried that the NEA was going to be, chopped again. And it's like, really, it's not even like 1% of the overall like budget for the country, but yet that's what people go after. That's like the easy target for like politicians to go after or something, to get rid of, or cut somehow. So, but just to maybe just go back, we don't really have questions in the chat, so so we'll just sort of like finish up on our own with our questions. And I just wanted to go back to the loft movement, because the loft scene, because that to me is, I think that's like what you're saying. There's sort of the antithesis of what we see going on now. I mean, it's just this was a time when that area, the Lower East Side, all over, but the Lower East Side was just really rich. There was so much going on. And so can you guys, both talk a little bit about, Mr. Parker, your experience and what that was like, being in a place where there was all these, the University of the Streets, alleys, all these Studio We, all these different places where artists were just making their own spaces and performing and being creative. you know, in amidst all this other, you know, radical politics, you know, radical theater, radical poetry, all this stuff was going on. It must have been like just a really heady time to be creating.
Well, it was a time where I mean, that's where you learned your craft. That's where you learned and discovered, you know, what was under, you know, behind the curtain. And in order to learn what's behind the curtain, you have to open it up and pull. And so you can study about how the curtain is made and how you pull it and all this, but in order to really get inside of it, you have got to do it. And in those times, I mean, it was a period where I would leave my house early in the morning, and sometimes I would walk from the Bronx down across 155th Street Bridge into Manhattan, and walk all the way down to, you know, Studio We, and I'd play all day long. I get, you know, like from 11 in the morning till 3 at night, just playing with different people, you know, and meeting different people, and you know, Tommy Turrington, you know, 1 Minute, Gratian Moncourt, Jackie McLean, all the musicians, you know, I heard on the records I was meeting. You know, I met Billy Higgins, and Billy Higgins invited me out to his house, and I would go out to Brooklyn and play with him for hours. You know, 3 times a week I do that at one period. In fact, that's where I met Wilbur Ware at Billy Higgins' house. I met him and Clifford Jordan down there in Billy's basement. So there was all of this stuff going around. Everyone had plenty of energy. No one was worn down, you know, and it was just about music, music. It was just good vibration and flow in the air. And it was just about, you know, playing and discovering. So it was a wonderful feeling and a wonderful time. Nobody even, in fact, you could pay your rent if you worked at a copy shop, and you worked at the copy shop from 8 o'clock to 12, and you got off at noon. You had your choice. You could go home and look at the ceiling all day, or you could drink coffee in the coffee shop, or you could practice all day, you could jam all day, and you had time to think. You had time to relish in books of poetry, and go to the art galleries and talk to people about music, and discover, you know, go down and talk to Sam Rivers. You know, he'd say, yeah, come on in and talk to him about things. And Sam had an opera company down there at Studio Rigby. He had a big band, and you know, you just hang out and learn from people. So it was very, very, very fruitful for anybody that wanted to partake and come down. And then you go up to the Bronx and play, or there was places out in Brooklyn. You go to the East, Tim Claver place,
Mm-hmm.
you know, which was another place. That was an Afrocentric, black-owned place, the East. And Pharoah Sanders used to play out there. Archie Shepp, all the musicians. Freddie Hubbard played out there. You know, Rahsaan Roland Kirk. And so you were just eating the music up. It was just like a musical banquet.
Um, Actually, there is a comment. It's not a question, but maybe a comment, but maybe it might be something someone wants to comment on in the Facebook. Emerdine says, as long as musicians continue to play for $50, it'll never change. This idea, I guess, of you know, musicians sort of sometimes take low-paying gigs. So is that like, if musicians keep taking the low-paying gigs, you're not going to get people to start paying more, or is that like or should the organizations and the bars and other places be paying better? Or, so whose fault is it, I guess, for the thing staying low, the pay rate staying low?
Well, the reason the bars don't want to, you know, I mean, they don't appreciate the music, and they don't get any subsidy. And if you go to Holland and play, all the bars and that's are considered cultural centers. They get a stipend from the government to pay musicians. So everyone gets a certain amount of money whenever they play a gig. They get money to rehearse. They get money to study. And you could not take the gigs, and some people will say, okay, I'll save that $50. I'll get somebody else to do the gig. There's always somebody that's going to do the gig that just got out of music school that just wants to play. So there'll always be somebody. So just not saying I'm not going to do the gig is going to get you money. You have to do more than that. You know, you have to because every musician, from you mentioned Herbie Hancock to Miles Davis to the most unknown musician, goes to Europe to make them. If you subtract Japan and Europe at certain times from these musicians' careers, I mean, the money would be very low. The only thing we can do is we'd have to, again, have a union, a creative musician union that actually worked for the musicians and put pressure on clubs and the government to kick things up a notch.
And I think in some ways, I think there have been times in which musicians had better, in some ways, had greater labor protections in the past than they do now. So, I think there are a lot of issues there, and it's sort of the decline of labor organizations in the U.S. in general. But I think without any sort of collective action, I can't, it's hard to imagine how things would positively change.
So I think we're gonna start. We can sort of wind down. I would like to ask maybe each of you to just talk about just upcoming projects. Again, well, first, before we do that, the book Universal Tonality. Cisco, you should tell people where they can buy it or purchase it. It's really amazing. As I mentioned, this book has just it's really great. A lot of coverage about not just Mr. Parker's life and his career, but just sort of the context of what was going on in the New York City scene, free jazz, and the different context of what was going on in the community, the politics at the time, and also Mr. Parker just has incredible excerpts of his poetry and his prose that are just really beautiful. So it's really great to learn about all this. So where can they find it? Where can people purchase the book?
You can get it, at your local bookstore. You could order it, I'm sure. You can certainly find it online. If it's no difference to you, I would say it'd be great if you ordered it from your local bookstore, because that makes them aware of it. And I think it's just great, to support local bookstores. So, yeah.
Great. Well, and then to end, you and I know Cisco, you're working on some more books, right? You're working on a couple others. Do you want to tell people about what's coming up, other projects?
Yeah. I have a couple of things I've been working on. One is that I've been writing a bit about sort of a younger generation musicians that they sort of came up in Brooklyn. So I've been looking at I'm in the final stages of writing a book about the Williamsburg experimental music scene as it existed kind of from the late 80s and really kind of peaking in the late 90s and early 2000s up to the early 2010s before it was gentrified out. So that book really looks at a lot of what happened there, but also looking at gentrification and how arts communities are being pretty seriously affected. And of course, now Williamsburg is in some ways the sort of one of the quintessential kind of examples of gentrification and displacement of populations and so forth. So, but that book looks at kind of I guess what some people call the musical underground of Williamsburg. During that time period. I'm also working on some research on kind of the earlier roots of free jazz. So I've been looking at different regions of the country, and especially lately I've been doing a lot of research on the roots of the communities in Cleveland, Detroit, and Buffalo. Just to throw some names out there, figures like Albert Eiler, because he came out of Cleveland, but also Frank Wright, Charles Tyler, Bobby Few, some great players that came out of Cleveland. Also looking at Charles Gale in Buffalo and a number of players in Detroit, Farouk Bey, all of the people that organize around the arts collective Tribe in Detroit, Wendell Harrison, Phil Ranelin, and many others. So I've been kind of looking at I think really trying to understand the deep roots of how those communities formed in the first place. So I've been doing a bit of research on the Great Migration and the formation of a basic sort of autonomous Black cultural space in places like Cleveland, Detroit, and Buffalo, and kind of how that gave birth to a lot of music in those places. So that's another project. And I do have other things always kind of in the works. So, that's what I've been working on recently.
And people can go to jazz.
In his upcoming book, will you be talking, or getting into the scene in Chicago as well?
I'm hoping to eventually do some. That would be another phase of the research. But yeah, Chicago obviously has an incredible scene. I love the scene in Chicago. As a person who grew up in Wisconsin, I feel like that's where I went to hear interesting, adventurous music. So I always try to go down to Chicago to check things out. So yeah, but I mean, you don't have to wait for my book. You should read George Lewis's book, Power Stronger Than Itself. That's a great, I mean, I think it's one of the greatest books ever written about American music. It covers the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which was the great arts organization set up in the South Side of Chicago in the '60s, and is still going today. So that's another, I would always recommend that book. But there's a lot of other things written, of course. But Chicago, very dear to my heart in terms of all the amazing musicians that have been there and continue to play there.
And people can follow everything that you're doing, jazzrightnow.com, right?
Yeah. There are a lot of the interviews that I've conducted over the years. I think I've published, I don't know, 100 or a couple hundred interviews there. So check those out. There's an earlier interview with William, the one that we did before we started working on the biography. So there's one there. And there's a lot of other musicians that have been working in New York and elsewhere that are chronicled there.
Thank you. And Mr. Parker, I know in reading the book, you're involved in so many different ensembles, and you're do all kinds of work on your music within the community. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you're busy with right now and things that are going on?
Well, I'm doing some teaching over at the new school, and also beginning a program at ICE, the high school on 16th Street. Also, through Arts for Art, we have a program called Music is Mine, and we have an ensemble that we're a mixed ensemble, and we meet periodically. We're meeting every week in the summer now. We're trying to lock it down to a certain period, and we're teaching improvisation to these younger people. And musically, this weekend I'm going to the Edge Fest in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with tenor saxophone player Mixashawn Lee Razi, and from the indigenous person, and Francisco Mela, who's a drummer from Cuba, and we'll be doing a trio there. And later on, I'll be doing some local gigs with saxophone player Zoe Amba, with Mark Edwards, and a few other different drummers. And which leads us up to February. I go to Paris, and we do a big piece called Trail of Tears, the Continuum, from 1492 to 2022. And that involves video, dancers, and 20 musicians. And so looking forward to that. And I finish off after that. I'm going up to Bennington College, and I'm artist in residence there for the spring semester at Bennington. And there's lots of other things. There's more books, another conversations books. There's also the tone poem, Music in the Shadow People. There's lots of stuff happening. So I hope that's all of this stuff is being posted online somewhere where people can follow it.
And reading Cisco's book, you actually have books of your own. You have books too, right? People can people purchase them in places like your poetry.
Yeah, I think through I've got a book on aesthetics, Who Owns Music, published by Buddy's Knife, and you can get that through Amazon or maybe through my website, William Parker Music. And then there are 3 books called Conversations 1, 2, and 3, which were inspired by the Arthur Taylor book, Notes and Tones, which is a musician on musician interview. And we have 35 musicians in each book. And the 4th one is coming out in June. And then there's some other books, Scrapbook, and which was a sort of a recollections of my musings about music and poetry, and an art book called Voices in the First Person, which is I do interviews with 4 visual artists. So these you have to look for, but you check the website out, and also Amazon.com should have these. I know a lot of people don't like Amazon.com, but you can also check your local bookstore, Cisco said, and they can order it. So you can really support. We got to bring back record stores. We got to bring back bookstores,
Mm-hmm.
and they can do it. You know, they just have to get a hip mayor and some hip politicians where you can put big ads on the buses. Stop downloading music for free. You know,
Mm-hmm.
get hip, buy CDs, or pay for the music. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you pay the electrician, you pay the plumber,
Exactly.
the musician.
Well, thank you so much. You're incredibly busy. Your next year is very
Indeed.
filled. It's pretty incredible. And we want to thank both of you for taking the time to talk to us tonight. We're so
Thank you.
happy to always talk to someone about the Bronx, because we're still here doing things in the Bronx. For everyone, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Parker. Thank you, Cisco Bradley, for tonight's conversation. Please keep aware of everyone watching. Stay tuned to our Facebook page, BX Music. We have a whole bunch of programs coming up this weekend, live programming. So we hope to see you there. And thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Real
thank you,
honor.
Maestro. And thank
Right.
you, Cisco.